December 19, 1944. Stalag Luft III, Western Poland. The morning arrived cold and grey, the kind of December morning where breath hangs in the air and frost clings to everything it touches. Inside the wooden barracks of the American compound, Lieutenant Colonel Albert P. Clark stood at the window watching German guards pace the perimeter wire, their rifles slung over their shoulders, their faces hidden beneath the upturned collars of heavy greatcoats. Clark had been a prisoner of war for 11 months. Shot down over Germany in his B-17, he'd survived the bailout, survived the interrogation at Stalag Luft, and survived his transfer to this camp 70 miles southeast of Berlin. He'd learned to measure time differently here. Not in days or weeks, but in Red Cross parcels, in letters from home, in small victories against boredom and despair. But this morning was different. In the camp hospital, 23-year-old First Lieutenant William R. Lawley lay dying. He'd arrived at Stalag Luft III 3 weeks earlier, carried on a stretcher from a transport train, his body shattered by wounds sustained when his bomber went down over Bavaria. The German camp doctors had done what they could with their limited supplies, but everyone knew the truth. Lawley was fading. The other prisoners watched over him in shifts, sitting beside his bed through the long winter nights, talking to him when he was conscious, simply being present when he slipped into fevered sleep. They'd seen men die before in this camp. Disease, despair, sometimes a guard's bullet for some real or imagined offense against the endless regulations. But Lawley was different. He'd remained conscious long enough to tell them about his last mission. How his B-24 had been torn apart by flak over the synthetic oil plant at Politz. How he'd stayed at the controls while his crew bailed out, fighting to keep the burning aircraft level long enough for his men to escape. How he'd finally jumped at impossible altitude, his parachute barely opening before he hit the ground hard enough to shatter his left leg in 3 places and puncture his lung with a broken rib. The German soldiers who'd captured him had been surprisingly gentle, calling for medics immediately, stabilizing his injuries before transport. But the damage was too severe. Infection had set in during the journey to Stalag Luft III. By the time he arrived at the camp, his fate was already sealed. Colonel Clark had watched Lawley deteriorate over those 3 weeks, watched a young pilot who should have been celebrating Christmas at home in Indiana instead waste away in a prisoner of war camp 6,000 miles from everyone he loved. It seemed impossibly cruel, even in a war that had already demonstrated cruelty on scales that defied comprehension. The Germans who ran Stalag Luft III were Luftwaffe personnel, not SS. Most were World War I veterans, older men who'd fought in the skies above France and understood what it meant to be a combat pilot. They maintained correct, if not friendly, relations with their prisoners. The camp commandant, Oberst Friedrich-Wilhelm von Lindeiner-Wildau, was a Prussian officer of the old school who believed in treating prisoners according to the Geneva Conventions, even as his country's war effort collapsed around him. This adherence to military protocol created a strange dynamic in the camp. The Americans and British prisoners lived behind barbed wire, watched constantly by guards with orders to shoot escapees. Yet they also received proper medical care when supplies permitted, adequate food rations supplemented by Red Cross parcels, and treatment that, while far from comfortable, avoided deliberate cruelty. The prisoners organized their lives with military precision, maintaining rank structure and discipline despite captivity. They staged theatrical productions, taught classes to each other, planned elaborate escape attempts, and tried to remember what normal life felt like beyond the wire. They created a small civilization within the camp, a way of preserving dignity and purpose when the war had stripped away everything else. But they were still prisoners. Still trapped. Still powerless to control their own fates. Lieutenant Lawley died just before dawn on December 19. The American medical officer, Captain Michael O'Brien, had been with him at the end. Lawley had regained consciousness briefly in those final moments, long enough to whisper something about wanting to go home, then slipped away quietly as winter light began seeping through the hospital windows. O'Brien closed Lawley's eyes, pulled the thin blanket over his face, and sat in silence for several minutes before standing to inform Colonel Clark. The death of a prisoner was an administrative matter requiring notification of the German authorities. There would be paperwork, records, eventual notification of next of kin through neutral channels. The machinery of war ground forward even in this small death. What nobody expected was what happened next. Colonel Clark reported Lawley's death to the camp commandant that morning, as protocol required. Oberst von Lindeiner received the news formally, expressed brief condolences in careful English, and made notes in his daily log. Then he said something that surprised Clark. Your lieutenant will receive a proper military funeral. Clark hadn't expected this. Dead prisoners were usually buried quickly with minimal ceremony, the bodies interred in marked graves that families might someday reclaim if they survived the war's conclusion. But von Lindener was proposing something different. Something that suggested this death meant more than just another name added to the terrible accounting of the war. We will provide an honor guard, von Lindener continued. The ceremony will be conducted with full military courtesies. Your men may attend, of course. And we will ensure the burial ground is properly marked and maintained. Clark accepted, uncertain what to make of this unexpected generosity from his captors. Was it genuine respect for a fallen airman? A propaganda gesture? Simply adherence to military protocol that transcended the circumstances of war? The funeral was scheduled for the following afternoon. Word spread through the American compound immediately. The prisoners began preparing as best they could. Someone fashioned a crude coffin from scrap lumber. Others worked on an American flag, painstakingly stitching together pieces of fabric saved from old clothes and painted with whatever materials they could scrounge. It wasn't perfect, but it was recognizably the Stars and Stripes. Captain O'Brien and 2 other officers cleaned and dressed Lawley's body, removing the tattered flight suit he'd worn since his capture and replacing it with the cleanest uniform shirt and trousers they could assemble from donated clothes. They had no shoes for him, so they wrapped his feet in clean cloth. It was the best they could do. The next morning brought more surprises. German guards delivered fresh pine boughs and holly branches to the American compound, materials for decorating the makeshift coffin. The camp carpenter appeared with better lumber and rebuilt the coffin to proper specifications. The German chaplain requested permission to participate in the service. None of this was required. The Geneva Conventions mandated decent burial, but this was something more. Something that suggested a recognition of common humanity even between enemies locked in a war that had already killed millions. That afternoon, as winter clouds gathered overhead and the temperature dropped toward freezing, the prisoners assembled outside their barracks. They formed ranks as if preparing for inspection, straightening worn uniforms and standing at attention despite cold that bit through their thin clothes. 6 officers lifted the flag-draped coffin and began the slow march toward the cemetery beyond the wire. And then they saw them. Standing at attention outside the American compound were 2 full companies of German guards. Over 200 soldiers in field gray uniforms, rifles at present arms, formed in perfect ranks along both sides of the path to the cemetery. The German camp band stood assembled near the gate, instruments ready. As the American pallbearers approached, a German officer barked a command. Every German soldier snapped to attention simultaneously. Another command, and 200 rifles came up in formal salute. The German band began playing. Not a German march. Not a Nazi anthem. They were playing, "Abide with Me," the old Christian hymn, slowly and solemnly as the American prisoners carried their dead comrade through the gates. Colonel Clark felt something shift in that moment. Something beyond surprise or gratitude. It was a recognition that cut through the categories of ally and enemy, prisoner and captor, victor and vanquished. The Germans standing at attention weren't performing for propaganda cameras. There were no journalists present, no official photographers documenting the scene for newspapers back home. This was simply soldiers honoring a fallen brother in arms. The procession moved through the camp gates and into the cemetery plot that had been prepared beyond the wire. The German guards maintained their salute as the Americans passed, faces solemn, rifles held steady despite the cold. Many were older men, veterans of the previous war who understood exactly what it meant to die far from home. Some had sons serving on the Eastern Front, on U-boats in the Atlantic, in the skies over Germany. They knew that this young American pilot could just as easily have been one of their own children. The cemetery sat on a slight rise overlooking the camp. Someone had already dug the grave, 6 feet deep in ground that must have been frozen solid. Fresh earth was piled neatly to one side. A simple wooden cross stood at the head of the grave, inscribed with Lawley's name, rank, and date of death. German soldiers had made it, carved the letters carefully, treated the wood to help it survive the weather. Behind the American pallbearers came the rest of the compound's prisoners, over 300 men walking in formation despite having no obligation to do so. Some were officers who'd known Lawley during his brief time in the camp. Others had never spoken to him but came anyway because he was American, because he was a pilot, because he died far from home and deserved witnesses to his passing. At the graveside, the Americans formed a semicircle around the plot. The German guards took positions on the opposite side, creating a full circle of military men around one dead pilot. The German chaplain and the senior American chaplain, Captain Henry Walsh, stood at the head of the grave. Captain Walsh began the service. He spoke about Lawley's courage, about his sacrifice ensuring his crew escaped their burning bomber, about his dignity during captivity despite terrible wounds. He read from the Bible, his voice steady despite the emotion behind it. The German chaplain followed, speaking in heavily accented English about the shared burden of soldiers who serve their countries, about loss that transcends nationality, about hope for peace. The words were simple. The ceremony was brief. But something profound was happening that transcended the formal prayers and military protocol. Two groups of men who'd been trained to kill each other, who'd fought in the same terrible war, who represented nations locked in struggle to the death, were standing together in recognition that some bonds survive even war's attempts to destroy them. After the chaplains finished, a German officer stepped forward. He saluted the coffin, held the salute for a long moment, then turned to Colonel Clark. "Your lieutenant flew bravely," he said in clear English. "He died with honor. We will ensure his grave is maintained and protected, regardless of how this war ends." Clark returned the salute. He wanted to say something but couldn't find words adequate to the moment. So he simply nodded. The pallbearers lowered the coffin into the grave. The American flag was carefully removed, folded with precise military ceremony, and presented to Captain O'Brien to be preserved until it could eventually be sent to Lawley's family. Then the first handfuls of frozen earth were dropped onto the wooden coffin. The German band played again. This time they played "Amazing Grace," another hymn familiar to both Germans and Americans, words about redemption and hope sung in churches across both nations before the war tore everything apart. The music drifted across the winter landscape, slow and mournful, carrying grief that knew no nationality. When the final notes faded, the German camp commandant stepped forward. He removed his cap, held it over his heart, and bowed his head for a long moment of silence. His officers followed his example. Then every German soldier in the cemetery did the same, 200 men removing their caps in unison and standing bareheaded in the December cold. The Americans stood frozen, uncertain how to respond to this gesture from their captors. Then Colonel Clark removed his cap. His officers followed. Every American prisoner in the cemetery stood bareheaded in the freezing afternoon. For perhaps a minute, perhaps longer, time seemed suspended. Hundreds of men stood in absolute silence around a fresh grave. No commands were given. No protocol dictated this moment. It simply happened, an organic recognition of shared humanity that needed no orders or explanations. Finally, the German commandant replaced his cap. The moment ended. Commands were shouted in German. The guards reformed their ranks. The ceremony was over. But as the prisoners filed back through the gates into their compound, something had changed. The guards who'd saluted a dead American pilot returned to their posts watching American prisoners, rifles once again slung in ready positions, faces returning to professional neutrality. Yet the transformation that had occurred couldn't be undone. Everyone present had witnessed something that contradicted the narrative of absolute enmity the war required. That evening, in the American barracks, the prisoners gathered in small groups processing what had happened. Some remained suspicious, convinced the funeral had been propaganda theater designed to demonstrate German respect for Geneva Conventions. Others saw it differently, as a genuine moment of military respect that transcended the war's hatreds. Lieutenant Frank Payne, a P-51 pilot who'd been shot down in October, sat writing a letter to his wife that he would eventually send through Red Cross channels. He tried to describe the funeral but found himself struggling with words. "I don't know how to explain what happened today," he wrote. "The Germans who guard us, who shoot prisoners who try to escape, who serve a regime we're fighting to destroy, they stood at attention and saluted while we buried Bill Lawley. They played hymns. Their chaplain prayed over his grave. Their commandant promised to protect his burial site. Maybe it means nothing. Maybe it's just military protocol that doesn't change anything about this war or what we're doing to each other. But it felt important. It felt like something true was happening that the war couldn't touch." In the days following Lawley's funeral, subtle changes rippled through Stalag Luft III's daily routines. The guards who participated in the ceremony seemed marginally less rigid in their enforcement of petty regulations. Conversations between prisoners and guards, while still brief and formal, occasionally acknowledged the funeral as shared experience. One German sergeant, a World War I veteran named Hermann Fischer who'd fought at Verdun, approached Colonel Clark during evening inspection. Fischer's English was limited, but he managed to convey that he'd lost his own son over Stalingrad 2 years earlier, that the Soviets had never returned the body, that he understood what Lawley's family would face. War makes enemies of men who should be brothers, Fischer said carefully. Your pilot, my son, they die for ideas men in capitals create. We who stand in mud, we know better. But we serve anyway. Clark didn't know how to respond to this confession from a guard. Fischer seemed to recognize the discomfort because he stepped back, resumed his formal posture, and continued the inspection routine as if the conversation hadn't happened. But it had happened, and both men knew it. Similar moments occurred throughout the camp. A guard shared tobacco with prisoners he was supposed to be watching. Another guard looked the other way when prisoners traded with each other, violations of regulations he normally enforced. These weren't acts of rebellion or even deliberate kindness. They were just small recognitions that the men on both sides of the wire had witnessed something together that created obligations the official-enemy relationship couldn't erase. The transformation wasn't universal. Some German guards remained rigid in their interpretation of duty, suspicious of any gesture that might undermine authority. Some American prisoners remained contemptuous of their captors, refusing to see the funeral as anything more than cynical performance. War had created genuine hatreds alongside enforced enmity, and one ceremony couldn't undo accumulated anger and loss. But for many prisoners, the funeral became a reference point, a moment that suggested the possibility of something beyond the war's apparent totality. Captain Walsh, the chaplain who presided over Lawley's burial, began conducting expanded religious services that occasionally included German officers who attended quietly at the back of the makeshift chapel. The services never explicitly addressed the funeral, but everyone understood what had made these shared gatherings possible. The camp's senior American officer, Colonel Charles Goodrich, found himself navigating an impossible balance. His responsibility was maintaining American military discipline and continuing the war effort through escape planning and intelligence gathering. Fraternizing with the enemy was explicitly forbidden. Cooperation with captors was grounds for charges after liberation. Yet the funeral had created a situation where rigid adherence to those principles seemed to deny something important. Goodrich eventually decided that maintaining military respect between adversaries didn't constitute fraternization or cooperation. The Americans could honor the Germans' gesture at Lawley's funeral without compromising their duty or loyalty. This decision proved crucial 2 weeks later when tensions erupted over escape attempts. Several prisoners had been working on a tunnel system, typical activity in a POW camp. The Germans discovered the tunnel during a routine inspection. Protocol dictated that the prisoners involved be placed in isolation and potentially transferred to punishment camps. But Oberst von Lindeiner handled the situation differently. He summoned Colonel Goodrich, showed him evidence of the tunnel, and proposed a compromise. The Americans would formally abandon that particular escape route. In exchange, the involved prisoners would remain in camp rather than being transferred. No formal punishment beyond brief isolation. We both have duties, von Lindeiner explained. You must try to escape. I must prevent escape. But after what we shared at Lieutenant Lawley's funeral, I prefer we accomplish our duties with less violence. Goodrich accepted the compromise, knowing his superiors might later question his decision. But the funeral had demonstrated that war's requirements didn't automatically preclude honor between enemies. Both officers understood that they could maintain their military obligations while acknowledging their common humanity. The transformation extended beyond individual relationships. The entire camp's atmosphere shifted subtly. Guards became marginally more lenient in interpreting regulations. Prisoners became marginally less antagonistic in their daily interactions with captors. These weren't dramatic changes, the wire still separated prisoners from freedom, the war still demanded that Germans prevent escape while Americans sought it. But the sharp edges of absolute enmity had been dulled slightly. When Red Cross parcels arrived in January, the German guards helped unload and distribute them with unusual efficiency, even supplementing the official allotments when supplies ran short. When a fire broke out in one barracks that same month, German soldiers worked alongside American prisoners to extinguish it, handing buckets in a human chain that ignored the boundary the war had created. These cooperative moments would have been impossible before Lawley's funeral. Not because anyone had changed their fundamental beliefs about the war or their obligations. But because the funeral had proven that treating enemies with dignity didn't compromise military duty. The Germans could still be effective prison guards while honoring the humanity of their prisoners. The Americans could still be loyal soldiers while recognizing that their captors were also men serving under impossible circumstances. Perhaps the most significant consequence was invisible, revealed only through letters prisoners sent home and diaries they kept secret. Lieutenant Payne continued writing to his wife about the strange moral complexity of camp life after the funeral. Before that day, I could hate the Germans simply and completely. They were the enemy, faceless and cruel. But after watching their guards salute Bill's coffin and hearing their chaplain pray over his grave, I can't maintain that simplicity anymore. I still want to escape. I still want us to win this war. But I can't pretend the men guarding me are monsters. Some of them are just soldiers doing their duty, trying to survive this war the same as we are. That doesn't excuse what Germany has done, but it complicates how I think about the individual Germans I see every day. Stalag Luft III was liberated in late January 1945, as Soviet forces advanced westward through Poland. The German staff evacuated the camp ahead of the Soviet arrival, marching thousands of prisoners westward in the infamous Long March through winter conditions that killed many weakened men. The Americans who'd attended Lawley's funeral found themselves on roads covered with snow and ice, struggling to survive the forced march while Soviet artillery rumbled behind them. But before they left, several prisoners made a final visit to Lawley's grave. They found it exactly as Oberst von Lindeiner had promised, maintained, protected, marked with a proper cross. Despite the chaos of Germany's collapsing war effort, despite the evacuation and retreat, someone had taken the time to ensure this American pilot's grave remained respected. The prisoners who survived the long march and eventual liberation carried memories of the funeral with them. Most returned to civilian life, trying to rebuild normal existence after years of war and captivity. But the experience of that December day remained vivid, a touchstone that complicated simple narratives about enemies and evil. Frank Payne became a lawyer in Chicago after the war. He served in veterans organizations, gave occasional talks about his POW experience, and maintained correspondence with other Stalag Luft III survivors. In the 1970s, when German veterans began organizing reunions with their former American prisoners, Payne accepted an invitation to return to the campsite, now in communist Poland but still accessible for special visits. There he met Hermann Fischer, the German sergeant who told him about his son lost at Stalingrad. Fischer was elderly now, his uniform replaced by a worn civilian suit, his military bearing softened by age. But he remembered the funeral, remembered standing at attention in the December cold saluting an enemy pilot. I have thought about that day many times, Fischer told Payne through a translator. During the last months of the war, when everything collapsed around us, when I wondered if anything we'd done had meaning, I would remember standing with your colonel at that young pilot's grave. How we put aside the war for 1 hour to simply be soldiers honoring another soldier. It gave me something to hold on to when everything else was falling apart. Payne understood. The funeral had been the same for him, a moment that proved humanity could survive even in war's most dehumanizing circumstances. Not often, not easily, but possible. The German officers who'd organized the funeral faced their own reckoning after the war. Oberst von Lindeiner was captured by Soviet forces and spent years in Russian prison camps, subjected to the same conditions he tried to mitigate for the Allied prisoners under his supervision. He survived and eventually returned to Germany, where he lived quietly until his death in 1963. Many Stalag Luft III survivors, learning of von Lindeiner's fate, wrote letters to occupation authorities testifying to his humane treatment of prisoners. They described how he'd maintained Geneva Convention standards despite pressure from Berlin to be harsher, how he'd organized the funeral for Lieutenant Lawley, how he'd risked his career to prevent worse treatment of the men under his charge. These testimonials didn't spare von Lindeiner from Soviet imprisonment, but they provided some measure of acknowledgement that his conduct had been observed and appreciated. After his return to Germany, he received regular correspondence from former prisoners, including Christmas cards and invitations to reunions. He rarely attended, the experience of the war had left him deeply traumatized, but he kept the letters, evidence that his attempt to maintain honor during a dishonorable war had meant something to the men whose lives he controlled. Lieutenant William R. Lawley's body remained at Stalag Luft III until after the war, when American graves registration teams worked to recover and repatriate American dead from camps and battlefields across Europe. His remains were finally returned to Indiana in 1948, 3.5 years after his death, and he was buried with full military honors near his family home. His parents attended the ceremony, elderly and heartbroken, having waited years for the return of their son's body. The army officer who delivered the remains told them about the funeral at Stalag Luft III, about how American prisoners and German guards had stood together honoring their son. He showed them photographs taken clandestinely by prisoners and smuggled out of the camp, showing the flag-draped coffin surrounded by soldiers from both armies. Lawley's mother kept those photographs for the rest of her life. She told visitors that learning about the funeral had provided a strange comfort, proof that her son hadn't died alone and forgotten in an enemy prison camp, but had been honored by both his comrades and his captors. It didn't erase the loss, but it suggested that some basic human decency had survived even in the war that killed her son. The story of the funeral circulated gradually through veterans' communities after the war. It appeared in memoirs published by former prisoners, in histories of Stalag Luft III, in accounts of POW life. Each retelling emphasized different aspects, some focused on German respect for military tradition, others on how the ceremony demonstrated that Nazi ideology hadn't completely corrupted Wehrmacht soldiers, still others on how American prisoners had maintained dignity despite captivity. What remained consistent across all versions was the recognition that something extraordinary had happened. In a war characterized by industrialized slaughter, deliberate atrocities, and systematic dehumanization, two groups of enemies had paused to acknowledge their common humanity. They hadn't ended the war or changed its outcome. They hadn't resolved the ideological and political conflicts that had created the war. They'd simply demonstrated that respect between enemies remained possible even under the worst circumstances. This wasn't a story of enemies becoming friends. The Americans remained prisoners, the Germans remained their guards, both sides continued prosecuting the war according to their respective nations' objectives. But within that framework, they'd found space for a gesture that transcended the war's demands. They'd proven that recognizing an enemy's humanity didn't require abandoning military duty or loyalty to one's own cause. The ceremony at Stalag Luft III became a reference point for later discussions about military conduct and the laws of war. It demonstrated that even in total war between industrialized nations, individual soldiers retained moral agency. They could choose to honor enemies without betraying their own side. They could maintain professional respect without compromising military effectiveness. This lesson proved especially relevant in later conflicts, where distinctions between combatants and civilians became increasingly blurred, where unconventional warfare tested traditional concepts of military honor, where new technologies threatened to make war even more impersonal and absolute. The story of Lieutenant Lawley's funeral suggested that preserving humanity during war wasn't naive idealism but practical necessity, essential for maintaining the moral framework that distinguished soldiers from murderers. Several military academies now include the story of the funeral in their ethics curricula, using it to explore questions about duty, honor, and the treatment of enemies. Cadets debate whether the German guards' gesture was genuine respect or calculated propaganda, whether the American prisoners should have accepted the ceremony or refused to participate, whether maintaining military courtesy between enemies undermines or strengthens the prosecution of war. These debates never reach definitive conclusions because the questions themselves resist simple answers. But wrestling with the ambiguities is the point. War creates moral complexity that demands judgment rather than reflexive adherence to absolute principles. The funeral at Stalag Luft III exemplified that complexity, enemies honoring each other without ceasing to be enemies, combatants acknowledging shared humanity without abandoning their respective causes. The cemetery where Lieutenant Lawley was first buried no longer exists in its original form. The Stalag Luft III site was used by Soviet forces after the war, then gradually abandoned and reclaimed by Forrest. Some graves were relocated, others lost to neglect and time. But photographs and testimonials preserve the memory of what happened there in December 1944, when hundreds of soldiers paused in the midst of total war to recognize that some obligations transcended national loyalty. December 19, 1944 was not a turning point in World War II. It did not affect the war's outcome or change military strategy. It was one funeral among millions of deaths, one ceremony in a war that generated endless ceremonies of mourning and remembrance. But for the men who participated, it remained a defining moment that complicated their understanding of war, enmity, and humanity. Years later, those who attended Lawley's funeral would struggle to explain why it mattered so profoundly. The ceremony hadn't been particularly elaborate or unusual by military standards. The speeches were brief and conventional. The music was traditional. Nothing about the funeral's form distinguished it from countless other military burials. What made it extraordinary was simply that it happened at all. That in December 1944, as Germany fought for survival and Americans pushed toward final victory, soldiers from both sides paused to honor one dead pilot. That German guards who'd been ordered to prevent escape and maintain security instead stood at attention saluting an enemy's coffin. That American prisoners who'd been taught to hate Germans instead stood bareheaded in the cold acknowledging their captor's gesture. The transformation wasn't miraculous or complete. The war continued. Men died. Atrocities occurred. The funeral at Stalag Luft III didn't prevent any of that horror or meaningfully reduce the war's terrible cost. But it proved that war's totalizing logic had limits, that humanity could survive even in circumstances designed to crush it, that enemies could recognize each other's dignity without betraying their own causes. And perhaps that's enough. Not to redeem the war or justify its costs, but to demonstrate that even in war's worst extremes, when industrial societies mobilize every resource for total destruction, individual human choices still matter. The German guards who organized Lawley's funeral didn't have to do so. The American prisoners who attended didn't have to respond with respect rather than suspicion. But they made those choices anyway, creating a moment that suggested war doesn't destroy all possibility of moral action. The story endures not because it offers easy answers about war and peace, but because it illustrates the complexity of human behavior under extreme circumstances. We want war to be simple, good against evil, heroes versus villains. But the funeral at Stalag Luft III demonstrated that even in a war as clearly justified as the fight against Nazi Germany, individual encounters between enemies could reveal unexpected humanity that complicated any simple narrative. The men who stood around Lieutenant Lawley's grave that cold December afternoon, American prisoners and German guards, chaplains and officers, wounded survivors and aging veterans, were all trapped in a war larger than themselves, serving causes they couldn't fully control, fighting battles whose outcomes would be determined by industrial capacity and grand strategy rather than individual valor. But for 1 hour, they stepped outside that vast impersonal machinery and simply acknowledged each other as soldiers, as men, as humans sharing an impossible experience. The war resumed afterward. Duties returned. The wire still separated prisoner from guard. But something had been proven in that cemetery beyond the wire, something that survived the war's conclusion and echoes down through the decades whenever soldiers confront the question of how to maintain humanity while prosecuting organized violence. When the last World War II veteran passes away and living memory of the war fades into history, the story of Lieutenant Lawley's funeral will remain in archives and memoirs, preserved as evidence that even total war couldn't eliminate every possibility of decency between enemies. Future generations may judge it differently, as propaganda, as exception proving the rule of war's brutality, as naive sentimentality about a conflict that demanded absolute commitment. But the men who were there, American prisoners and German guards alike, knew what they'd witnessed. A moment when the war's demands paused, when ancient military traditions about honor and respect asserted themselves against modern total war's logic, when enemies recognized that their shared profession of arms created obligations that national loyalty couldn't completely override. That recognition didn't end the war or prevent its horrors. But it preserved something essential about human dignity that the war threatened to destroy. And in the end, perhaps that small preservation was its own kind of victory, not against an enemy nation but against war itself, against the idea that violence must inevitably destroy every possibility of honor and respect between opponents. Lieutenant William Lawley died far from home, surrounded by enemies, his body broken by wounds sustained in service to his country. But his death occasioned a ceremony that demonstrated war's limits rather than its totality, that proved humanity could survive even in circumstances designed to crush it. That may be the most fitting memorial for any soldier who dies in war, not that their sacrifice was glorious or their cause beyond question, but that their death was honored even by those who fought against everything they represented. In that recognition lies something indestructible about human nature, something that survives even total war's attempts to erase it. The cemetery at Stalag Luft III is gone. The guards who saluted have long since passed away. The prisoners who attended have joined the comrades they mourned. But the memory of that December afternoon remains, preserved in letters and diaries and testimonials, evidence that even in history's darkest chapters, individual humans retain the capacity for gestures that transcend the hatred war demands. That capacity doesn't redeem war or make it acceptable. But it suggests that even in war's worst extremes, moral choice survives, however limited and constrained. The men who stood at attention around Lieutenant Lawley's grave exercised that choice, honoring an enemy in the midst of total war, creating a moment that proved dignity and respect could survive even in history's most dehumanizing circumstances. And that proof, small and fragile as it may seem against the vast horror of World War II, remains worth remembering. Not as justification for war, but as evidence that humans retain the capacity for decency even when every pressure and incentive points toward absolute enmity. That capacity is what separates soldiers from murderers, what distinguishes honorable combat from simple slaughter, what preserves the possibility of peace even in the midst of war. The story of when a German POW camp stood to honor an American funeral is ultimately about that preservation, not of peace itself, which was impossible in December 1944, but of the possibility of peace, the recognition that enemies remain human despite war's attempts to dehumanize them. That recognition couldn't stop the fighting or save lives. But it kept alive something essential that would be needed when the fighting finally ended and survivors had to find ways to live together again. And in the winter of 1944, as the world tore itself apart and millions died, that preservation of future possibility was perhaps the most meaningful victory any soldier could achieve.